The Grand Conclave Hall aboard the space station known as Axiom Threshold was the largest gathering place ever constructed by any known civilization in the galaxy. And on this particular evening, it was filled to capacity with representatives from over 200 alien species who had traveled from every corner of known space to attend the biennial Galactic Accord Summit. The hall itself was a marvel of engineering that stretched nearly a full kilometer from end to end, with ceilings so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top and had to be dispersed by atmospheric drones, and every surface was lined with adaptive lighting that shifted color to accommodate the visual spectrums of the many species present, so that no delegate would feel unwelcome or unable to see. Seated upon elevated platforms, arranged in concentric rings, were beings of every shape and size imaginable, from the tiny crystalline Morvathi, who communicated through pulses of light, Drothi, whose armored bodies took up 3 seats each, and whose breathing alone sounded like the rumble of distant thunder. Among the 5 most prominent platforms, raised highest above the rest, sat the representatives of the elder civilizations, species so ancient and powerful that their empires had already spanned galaxies, while humanity was still learning to make fire on a small blue planet at the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm. On the grandest of these platforms, surrounded by attendants whose carapaces gleamed like polished gemstones, sat Queen Zarathia of the Velkari Dominion, and she was magnificent in a way that made every other being in the room feel small simply by existing near her. She stood nearly 3 meters tall, her insectoid body covered in an iridescent exoskeleton that shifted between deep emerald and royal purple with every subtle movement, and her compound eyes, each one containing thousands of tiny lenses, glowed with a cold amber light that seemed to evaluate everything and everyone around her with the patience of a creature who had ruled for over 300 years. Directly across the hall from the Velkari delegation sat the Krethari War Council. And if Zarathia was cold elegance, then War Chief Grothan and his warriors were barely contained violence given physical form. The Krethari resembled enormous bipedal wolves that had been armored by nature itself, standing 2.5 meters tall, with bone-plated hides and claws that could tear through starship hull plating. And their eyes burned with a predatory intelligence that reminded every species present why the Krethari had never lost a war in 10,000 years of recorded history. Grothan himself was the largest of them, scarred across his muzzle and chest from countless battles, and he sat with his massive arms crossed, and his lips occasionally pulling back to reveal teeth the length of a human finger. Humans. Humanity had joined the galactic community only 62 years ago, which in galactic terms was barely a heartbeat. And most elder species still regarded them as little more than clever animals who had stumbled upon faster-than-light travel by accident and somehow talked their way into a seat at the table. The human delegation was small, just 12 people led by Ambassador Dran Kellis, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that hid a sharp mind. And they occupied one of the lowest platforms in the hall, a position that made their status in the galactic hierarchy painfully clear. But tonight was the opening ceremony, and with it came one of the oldest traditions of the summit, the display of honors. Every species was expected to present their most decorated member, the individual who best represented the strength and achievement of their civilization. And one by one the delegations brought forward their champions, presented Admiral Scythrix, who had commanded the fleet that pacified the Outer Rim rebellions, and wore 17 crystalline honor thorns embedded directly into her carapace. The Krethari brought forward Bloodfang Kren, a warrior so fearsome that 3 species had surrendered entire star systems simply upon learning he had been assigned to the campaign against them, and his bone plates were carved with the symbols of 97 confirmed kills in single combat. The Drathi presented a general whose body was a living map of battles, and the Morvathi offered a scientist whose discoveries had reshaped the understanding of subspace physics across the galaxy. Each presentation was met with respectful acknowledgement from the assembled species, and the hall hummed with quiet admiration as legend after legend took the stage. Then, it was humanity's turn. Ambassador Kellis rose from his seat, and the hall grew quiet, not out of respect, but out of mild curiosity. Way one might watch a small animal attempt something amusing. Many in the hall expected the humans to present Admiral Chen, the woman who had led the defense of the Sol system during the border skirmish of 2309. Or perhaps General Vasquez, the man whose tactical brilliance had earned grudging respect even from the Krithari. Instead, Ambassador Kellis stepped aside, and from behind the human delegation walked a boy. He was 16 years old, lean and quiet, with dark hair and steady brown eyes that looked far too old for his young face, and he wore a simple Terran military dress uniform that was crisp and neat, but utterly unremarkable, compared to the elaborate ceremonial armor and regalia worn by every other honoree in the hall. His name was Elias Ward, and he was listed in the program as a junior cultural liaison attached to the Terran Diplomatic Corps. The only notable thing about his appearance was a single medal pinned above his heart, black metal rimmed in silver, that caught the light as he walked and seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. The hall erupted in whispers that the translators could barely keep up with. The Krithari growled openly, their lips pulling back in what was unmistakably contempt, and several of the Drothi made deep rumbling sounds that translated roughly to laughter. Elias walked to the center of the presentation stage and stood there, his hands at his sides, his expression calm but clearly uncomfortable under the weight of so many alien eyes. Queen Zarathia's compound eyes shifted from amber to a sharp crimson, a color that every species in the hall knew meant displeasure, and she leaned forward on her throne with a slow, deliberate motion that silenced the whispers instantly. When she spoke, her voice carried through the hall like the sound of cracking ice, amplified by the translation systems into every language simultaneously. "To stand among legends," she said, and the words dripped with a disdain so refined it was almost beautiful. "Is this meant as a jest, or have you chosen to insult every civilization present?" Ambassador Kellis stepped forward quickly, his diplomatic training kicking in as he began to form a careful response. But Zarathia raised one clawed limb and he stopped mid-breath. "Not you," she said without looking at him, her thousands of eyes fixed entirely on the boy. "I want the child to speak." The hall went perfectly silent. Zarathia rose from her throne and descended the steps of her platform with the fluid grace of a creature that had been born to rule, each step precise and unhurried, until she stood before Elias and towered over him like a living monument. She extended one long segmented limb and pointed directly at the small black medal on his chest. "Tell me, small creature," she said, and her voice was quiet now, but somehow even more dangerous for it. "What is that trinket, and what could you possibly have done to earn it?" Elias looked up at her, and to the amazement of every being watching, he did not flinch, and he did not look away. He took a single breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. The silence in the grand conclave hall was so complete that Elias could hear the faint hum of the translation systems, processing his every breath and converting it into 200 different languages simultaneously. And he could feel the weight of thousands of alien eyes pressing down on him like gravity itself had doubled. Queen Zarathia stood before him like a tower of living gemstone, her compound eyes burning with that sharp crimson light, and her clawed limb still pointed directly at the small black medal on his chest, as if it were something offensive that she wanted removed. Elias swallowed once, and then he spoke in a voice that was calm and clear, but carried no arrogance and no defiance, just the simple, steady tone of someone who had been asked a question and intended to answer it honestly. "Your Majesty," he said, "this medal is called the Obsidian Star, and in the Terran military it is our rarest decoration." Zarathia's eyes flickered, but did not change color, and she tilted her great head to one side with a motion that resembled a bird of prey examining something small and potentially interesting. "Every species claims their decorations are rare," she said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice now, the kind of amusement that a cat might feel watching a mouse try to explain why it should not be eaten. Elias nodded slowly, and several beings in the hall noted that the gesture carried no submission in it, only acknowledgement. "That is fair," he said, "so let me explain what makes it different, because I think the difference matters." He paused for just a moment, and then continued. "Most species in this hall award their highest honors for the greatest number of enemies killed, or the most territory conquered, or the most decisive victories won in battle," he said, and his eyes moved briefly across the assembled delegations as he spoke, past the Krethari with their carved bone plates, past the Drathi with their battle scars, past the dozens of warrior species who measured glory in blood. "The Obsidian Star is not given for killing," Elias said, and the words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. "It is awarded to a person, soldier or civilian, who through extraordinary personal sacrifice saved lives in a situation where survival was considered impossible by every reasonable measure." A murmur rippled through the hall, quiet but unmistakable, and the translation systems buzzed as hundreds of delegates whispered to their neighbors in languages that ranged from subsonic vibrations to ultraviolet light patterns. War Chief Grofan, who had been watching the entire exchange with the lazy contempt of a predator observing something beneath his attention, suddenly went still, and his burning amber eyes locked onto Elias with a focus that had not been there before. Zarathia studied the boy for a long moment, and those closest to her noticed that the crimson in her eyes had begun to soften at the edges, shifting towards something that might have been curiosity. "Extraordinary sacrifice," she repeated, and the words sounded strange in her translated voice, as if the concept was familiar, but the application of it to a human child was something she could not quite process. And what impossible situation did a child find himself in? Elias was quiet for a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not in volume or in steadiness, but in depth, as if the words were coming from somewhere further inside him than before. "2 years ago," he said, "I was living on a frontier colony called Meridian 4 with my mother and my younger sister Mara, who was 9 at the time." He paused, and the hall waited. Meridian 4 was a terraforming colony, one of the new ones on the edge of explored space, and it had about 1,200 people living there, mostly scientists, engineers, and their families, along with a small security team of maybe 30 personnel. "My mother was a terraforming engineer," he said, and something in his voice shifted when he said the word mother. Something so small that most species in the hall would not have caught it. But Zarathia caught it, because she was very old and very wise, and she had learned long ago that the most important things were always hidden in the smallest changes. The colony had been running heavy terraforming equipment for about 6 months, reshaping the soil composition and adjusting the atmosphere, and nobody knew that the vibrations from that equipment were traveling deep underground and disturbing something that had been sleeping beneath the surface. The hall was perfectly still now, and even the species that had been whispering fell silent, because there was something in the boy's voice that commanded attention, not through power or authority, but through the unmistakable weight of someone describing something they had actually lived through. "We called them lithivores when the science teams finally classified them," Elias said. "They were silicon-based creatures, massive. The smallest ones were the size of ground transports, and the largest were as big as buildings. And they lived deep in the planet's crust, where the pressure and heat kept them dormant. When the terraforming vibrations reached them, they woke up and they came to the surface. Grothon leaned forward in his seat, and his warriors noticed and exchanged glances, because their war chief did not lean forward for anything. Not for battle reports, not for threats, not for the boasting of rival species. They erupted from beneath the colony at midday, Elias continued, and his voice was steady, but his hands at his sides had curled slightly, and the knuckles were white. There was no warning, no seismic activity that our sensors detected in time, and within minutes the ground was breaking apart beneath buildings, and these enormous creatures were pushing through the foundations like they were made of paper. The communication tower went down in the first 5 minutes, which meant we could not call for help, and the security team responded immediately, but their weapons were designed for border patrol and minor threats, not for creatures made of living rock that shrugged off plasma fire like rain. He stopped for a moment and took a breath that everyone in the hall heard. My mother was in the science wing when the floor collapsed beneath it, he said, and his voice did not break, but it went very quiet. She did not make it out. Zarathia's eyes shifted color again, the crimson fading further, replaced by something darker and more complex that her attendants had not seen before. I grabbed my sister Mara, and I ran, Elias said, and for the next hour that is all anyone did. They ran, or they hid, or they died, because the lithivores were everywhere, and they were destroying everything, and there was nowhere safe above ground. By the end of the first hour, we had lost roughly 300 people, he said, and the number hung in the air of the hall like something physical. The security team was gone, either dead or buried, and most of the colony's adults who had been in the outer buildings were either killed or trapped under rubble that no one could move. He looked up at Zarathia, and for the first time since he had begun speaking, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Not fear, not grief, but the quiet, terrible clarity of someone who had looked at a hopeless situation and understood exactly what it meant. The nearest Terran military response was 11 hours away, Elias said. 11 hours before anyone with the weapons and the ships to fight these creatures could reach us. And when I finally found a group of survivors in the underground maintenance tunnels beneath the colony's east sector, I realized something that I will never forget for as long as I live. The hall waited, and even the ambient systems seemed to hold their breath. There were roughly 300 people in that group, he said. Over half of them were children from the colony school, who had been in the underground classrooms when the attack began, and the adults who were with them were either badly injured or in shock and unable to function. His voice did not waver, but it carried something that every species in the hall could feel, regardless of their biology or their culture, or their understanding of human emotion. I was 14 years old, he said, and I was the oldest person left alive in that sector who could still stand up and move. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for more words. It was the silence of over 200 species simultaneously understanding the shape of what they were about to hear. And for many of them, it was the first time they had ever felt something like dread on behalf of a human being. Zarathia's clawed limb had slowly lowered to her side, and she stood before Elias not as a queen demanding answers from an inferior, but as a creature who had begun to understand that she had gravely misjudged what was standing in front of her. Elias let the silence hold for a moment longer before he continued, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the tone of someone recounting events that played behind his eyes every single night, whether he wanted them to or not. The first thing I did was count, he said. I counted the people, I counted the children, I counted the injured, and I counted the exits. Because my mother always told me that when everything is falling apart, the first thing you do is count what you have left, and then you figure out what to do with it. Several beings in the hall, who were parents themselves, felt something tighten inside them at those words, because they recognized the voice of a child repeating a lesson taught by someone who was no longer alive to teach anything else. There were 312 people in the maintenance tunnels, Elias continued. 187 of them were children under the age of 12. 43 were teenagers between 13 and 15, and the rest were adults. But of those adults, only 11 could walk, and of those 11, only 4 were not in severe shock. He paused and then said something that made War Chief Grothon's ears flatten against his skull. So I told them I had a plan. I did not have a plan, Elias said, and there was no shame in his voice when he said it. Only honesty. I had a general idea of where the shuttle bay was, and I had spent 2 years exploring every maintenance tunnel and ventilation shaft and service corridor in the colony, because I was a bored teenager on a frontier world with nothing better to do. And that knowledge was the only advantage any of us had. The lithivores were too large to fit into the maintenance tunnels, which meant that as long as we stayed underground, we were relatively safe. But the tunnels did not connect directly to the shuttle bay. There were gaps where we would have to cross open ground, and the creatures were everywhere. Above us. He described what he did next with the same calm, steady voice, but the actions he described were anything but calm. He organized the survivors into groups of 20, each led by the oldest child or the most functional adult available. And he assigned every person a role. Some carried supplies, some carried the injured, some kept watch at tunnel junctions, and the youngest children were given the most important job of all. I told the little ones that we were playing a game, Elias said, and something in his expression shifted. A flicker of pain that was there and gone so quickly that only Zarathia, standing closest to him, saw it clearly. I told them we were playing hide-and-seek with the ground monsters, and that the rules were very simple. If they were quiet and followed their team leader, and did not cry, then we would win, and winners would get extra dessert rations when we got to the shuttles. Some of them were so scared, they were shaking. But children are brave in ways that most people do not give them credit for, and they played the game with everything they had, because they trusted me when I told them we could win. He led the first group himself, navigating through tunnels that were barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, climbing over collapsed sections on his hands and knees, and listening at every junction for the deep grinding vibrations that meant a lithivore was nearby on the surface above. The first crossing of open ground was 40 meters. 40 meters between the exit of one tunnel system and the entrance of another, with nothing overhead but open sky and rubble and the distant shapes of lithivores moving through what was left of the colony like living mountains. He got the first group across by timing the movements of the creatures and running the children in pairs, one older child holding the hand of one younger child, sprinting across the gap and diving into the tunnel entrance on the other side. It took 22 minutes to get the first group of 20 across, and during those 22 minutes, Elias stood in the open the entire time, directing traffic like a crossing guard on the most dangerous intersection in the history of the galaxy. Then he went back for the next group, and the next, and the next. The second time I had to cross open ground, the gap was wider, almost 80 meters, and there was a lithivore feeding on the mineral deposits in the collapsed foundation of the medical building, and it was directly between us and the next tunnel entrance, Elias said. The lithivores were drawn to vibrations, he continued. That was what had woken them up in the first place, and I realized that I could use that. So I found a maintenance panel in the tunnel wall, and I pulled out a pneumatic driver, a small tool that vibrates when you press it against a surface. And I went out into the open alone, and I activated it against the ground about 200 meters away from the crossing path. The hall was utterly still. A creature turned toward me, Elias said, and it was fast, faster than something that size had any right to be, and I ran. He described running through rubble and wreckage with a creature the size of a building behind him, its massive body grinding through concrete and steel as it chased the vibrations of his footsteps. And he described diving into a ventilation shaft that was barely wide enough for his teenage body, and crawling through absolute darkness while the creature slammed against the opening behind him, and the entire shaft shook so hard his teeth rattled. I circled back through the vent system and reached the group 11 minutes later, he said, and we made the crossing while the lithivore was still searching for me on the other side of the sector. He did this 3 times. 3 times he went out alone into the killing ground to draw the creatures away from 312 people who were counting on a 14-year-old boy to keep them alive. The 3rd time, the lithivore caught him. It came from below, Elias said, and his voice was very quiet now. The ground split open about 2 meters in front of me, and a limb came through. It was like a tree trunk made of granite, and it caught my left leg below the knee. He did not describe the sound, and he did not describe the pain, but every being in the hall understood both from the way his jaw tightened for just a moment before he continued. I pulled myself free, he said. The creature's grip shifted when it tried to push further through the crack in the ground, and I managed to drag myself into a drainage pipe about 10 meters away. My leg was broken in 4 places, and the lower portion was crushed, he said, with a clinical detachment that was more disturbing than any scream would have been. I found a welding torch in a maintenance supply kit that someone had left in the pipe, and I used it to seal the wound so I would not bleed to death. Zarathia's attendants noticed that their queen's limbs were trembling, not with anger or contempt, but with something else entirely, something that none of them had ever seen in her before. And then I kept going, Elias said. He crawled through that drainage pipe for 40 minutes until he reached the next tunnel junction, and then he fashioned a splint from a broken support strut, and he stood up and he walked, dragging his ruined leg behind him, like it belonged to someone else, because there were still people waiting for him to lead them to the shuttle bay. It took us 9 hours to get everyone to the shuttles, he said. 9 hours of crawling and running and hiding and carrying children who had fallen asleep from exhaustion, and keeping the injured alive with whatever medical supplies we could scavenge from wrecked buildings along the way. Personally carried 6 children who could not walk on their own, he said. 1 at a time, on my back, through tunnels and across open ground, because they were too small and too tired and too scared to move. On a broken leg, Zarathia said, and it was not a question. Yes, Elias said. He described the moment they reached the shuttle bay, and he saw the 4 emergency evacuation shuttles sitting on the landing pads with their systems still functional. And he described the sound that the children made when they realized they were going to be okay. Not cheering, not crying, just this quiet collective exhale, as if 300 people had been holding their breath for 9 hours, and finally allowed themselves to let it go. I loaded them onto the shuttles, Elias said, all 312 of them, plus another 535 survivors who had made it to the shuttle bay through other routes, and I made sure the injured were secured, and the children were strapped in and the launch sequences were initiated. And when the shuttles launched, he said, I was not on them. The sound that moved through the hall was not a gasp and not a murmur. It was something deeper, something that came from the collective recognition of every species present, that they were listening to something extraordinary. There was a group that had been cut off in the hydroponics wing on the far side of the colony, Elias said. 12 people, 8 of them children, and I had picked up a faint signal from them on a damaged communication relay while I was loading the shuttles. So I went back. Zarathia's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked the question that the entire hall was holding in their chests. Did you reach them? Elias met her eyes. I reached 9 of them, he said. 3 had already died before I got there. 2 adults and a child, a girl named Priya, who was 6 years. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes fractured, just for a moment, like light passing through cracked glass. I held Priya while she went, he said, because no one should leave this universe alone, and she was scared. And I told her it was okay, and I told her she was brave, and I do not know if she heard me, but I said it anyway. Then I picked up the 2 youngest children, and I put them on my back, and I led the remaining 7 through the last tunnel to the shuttle bay. And by the time we got there, the military rescue ships had arrived, and it was over. He paused, and then he said the words that landed in the hall like the tolling of a bell. 11 hours, he said. From the first breach to the arrival of the military, it was 11 hours. And all I had to do was keep them alive for 11 hours. Zarathia looked down at him, and her compound eyes had shifted to a color that her attendants did not recognize. Something between deep violet and the darkness of space itself. You were a child, she said, and her voice carried something it had not carried before. You were maimed, and you watched people die, and you could have escaped. So tell me, why did you not simply get on the shuttle when you had the chance? Why did you go back? Every being in the Grand Conclave Hall waited for the answer, and the silence was so deep and so total that it seemed as though the universe itself had paused to listen to what a 16-year-old human boy would say next. The translators hummed at their lowest operational frequency, ready to convert whatever came next into 200 languages. And even species that had been ancient rivals for millennia had stopped their private disputes and their quiet scheming to focus on the small figure standing before the towering alien queen. Elias was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, those closest to him could see something moving behind his eyes. Not rehearsed words, not a prepared speech, but the raw and difficult process of a young man deciding how to explain something that lived in the deepest part of him. When he finally spoke, he did not speak with the thundering voice of a warrior, or the polished cadence of a diplomat, or the dramatic flair of someone who knew the galaxy was watching. He spoke like a tired kid telling the truth because he did not know how to do anything else. Because they were scared, he said, and they were small, and there was no one else. The words were simple, and they were quiet, and they hit the hall like a shockwave. Zarathia did not move, and her thousands of eyes remained fixed on his face, as if she were seeing something she had never encountered in 300 years of ruling an empire that spanned star systems. Elias continued, and his voice was steady but raw, in a way that no amount of training or preparation could produce. In the Terran military they have a saying, "No one left behind," he said, but I was not a soldier, and I did not go back because of a saying. He paused and took a breath that the entire hall heard. I went back because I could hear Priya's little brother calling for her on the damaged communication relay, he said. His name was Arjun, and he was 4 years old, and he was calling his sister's name over and over, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I got on that shuttle and left, I would hear his voice calling for her every single night for the rest of my life. Something shifted in the hall, not a sound but a feeling, as if the emotional gravity of the room had suddenly increased, and every being present could feel it pressing against their chest, regardless of whether they had a chest or not. I could not live with that, Elias said, and the honesty in his voice was so complete and so unguarded that it was almost painful to witness. I could not live in a universe where I flew away safe, while a 4-year-old boy waited in the dark for a sister who was never coming back, and I could have been the one to carry him out. He looked up at Zarathia, and there was no challenge in his eyes, and no defiance, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already paid the highest price for his convictions, and would pay it again without hesitation. Your Majesty, you asked me what this medal means, he said, touching the small black disc on his chest with 2 fingers. And I have been thinking about how to answer that question ever since you asked it. Because the truth is that the medal itself does not mean very much. It is a piece of metal, he said. It does not bring back the 300 people who died on Meridian 4. And it does not give me back my mother. And it does not fix the nightmares that wake me up at 3 in the morning. And it does not make my leg grow back. His voice did not break, but it bent, just slightly, just enough for everyone to hear the weight it was carrying. What the obsidian star means, he said, is that a human being looked at a situation where the math said you will die, where every logical calculation and every survival instinct screamed at them to run and save themselves, and they chose to go back. Anyway, not because they were not afraid, he said. I was terrified, Your Majesty. I was so scared that my hands would not stop shaking for the first 2 hours, and I had to hold them behind my back so the children would not see. I went back because something mattered more than the fear. The silence in the hall had changed. It was no longer the silence of anticipation or curiosity, but the silence of recognition. The silence that falls when a room full of beings realizes simultaneously that they are witnessing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Elias looked across the hall, past Zarathea, past the Valkyrie delegation, to where War Chief Grothon sat, with his burning amber eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that would have made most species flee the room. I know what strength looks like, Elias said, and he spoke directly to the Crethari war chief with a respect that carried no fear. I know that the Crethari can break a human in half with one hand, and I know that the Valkyrie have conquered more star systems than humanity has even visited, and I know that there are species in this hall that were building empires when my people were still living in caves. Humans cannot do any of those things, he said. We are small, and we are fragile, and we break easily, and we live for such a short time, compared to most of you, that our entire lives must seem like the blink of an eye. But we will walk back into the fire for a stranger's child. The words landed in the hall, and they did not echo. They sank in, deep, past the translator algorithms and the cultural filters, and the 10,000 years of galactic politics, and they reached something fundamental in every being present. Every single time, Elias said, not because we are brave, because we are not because we are strong, because we are not that either, because we cannot live with ourselves if we do not. Being would rather die in the fire than spend the rest of their short little life knowing that they could have carried one more child out of the darkness, and they chose not to. That is what the obsidian star means, he said. That is what I did to earn it, and I stand here before all of you, not because I think I belong among your legends and your warriors and your conquerors, but because my people wanted you to know that this is what we are. This is what humanity is. We are the species that goes back. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the Grand Conclave Hall had ever contained. It lasted for 10 full seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you are standing in a room with 10,000 beings who have all simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. War Chief Grothon was the first to move. The most feared predator in the known galaxy, the warrior whose name alone had ended wars, pushed back from his delegation's table, stood, and his warriors tensed, because what he did next broke every protocol and every tradition the Crethari had followed for 10,000 years. He walked out from behind his table and crossed the open floor of the hall with heavy, deliberate steps that echoed like drum beats. And he stopped in front of Elias and towered over the boy by more than a full meter, his scarred face unreadable, and his amber eyes blazing. And then Grothon, war chief of the Crethari, dropped to one knee. He placed his massive clawed fist over his chest, and he bowed his head, his scarred, proud, undefeated head, before a 16-year-old human boy who barely reached his shoulder. His voice was deep and rough like stone grinding against stone, and when he spoke, the translators carried his words to every corner of the hall. Among the Crethari we have a word, he said, Vreth-Kalos. It means one who runs toward the dying, one who chooses the impossible path, not for glory, but because the dying should not die alone. We give this title only to our greatest warriors, he said. In 10,000 years of war and honor, we have given it 43 times, and never, not once, to an outsider. He looked up at Elias, and the boy saw something in those predator eyes that he had not expected to see. Respect so deep it bordered on reverence. "Until now," Grothan said. Behind him, one by one, every Krithari warrior in the delegation rose from their seats and dropped to one knee in perfect unison, fists over their chests, heads bowed. Then the Drathi stood, and their massive armored bodies dipped forward in the deepest gesture of honor their species possessed. Then the Skull, and the Morven, and the Thessari, and species after species after species, predators and scholars and warriors and diplomats, offering their own cultural signs of deepest respect in a rippling wave that spread through the hall like a tide coming in. Zerathia did not kneel, because queens of the Velkhari dominion do not kneel. Not for allies, not for enemies, not for gods. But she did something that her attendants would later describe as equally unprecedented, and that would be studied by Velkhari historians for centuries to come. She reached up to her own carapace, and with a precise, deliberate motion, she detached one of her ceremonial thorns, a piece of her own body, crystallized and sacred, given only to those she considered true equals, and she held it out to Elias in the palm of her clawed hand. "I asked you to clarify your metal, child of Earth," she said, and her compound eyes had shifted to a deep luminous violet that none of her attendants had ever seen before, a color that would later be identified in Velkhari historical texts as the expression of profound reverence, seen only during the crowning of queens and the mourning of heroes. "You have clarified something far greater," she said, at the crystalline thorn in her hand. And then he looked up at the queen, and then he looked around the hall at the thousands of beings who had risen or knelt or bowed, and his expression was not triumph, and it was not pride. It was the quiet, overwhelmed face of a boy who had just told the truth and could not understand why the entire galaxy was treating it like something extraordinary. He took the thorn from Zerathia's hand with both of his own, and his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of a moment that was far too large for a 16-year-old to fully comprehend. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said softly. And that was all he said, because Elias Ward had never been a boy of many words. He had simply been a boy who, when the time came, had the only words that mattered. The recording of what happened in the Grand Conclave Hall that evening spread across the galaxy faster than any broadcast in recorded history, carried by every news network and communication relay and diplomatic channel from the core worlds to the farthest frontier colonies. And within 72 hours, it had been translated into every known language spoken by every known species, and had been viewed more times than any single piece of media ever created. They called it the boy's answer. It was discussed in the war councils of predator species, and debated in the academic halls of ancient civilizations, and whispered about in the markets and gathering places of 1,000 different worlds. And everywhere, the reaction was the same mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration, and something deeper that most species did not have a word for, but that humans would have recognized immediately as being moved. Elias himself was deeply uncomfortable with all of it. Transport ship back to Earth, he sat at his small cabin and stared out the viewport at the stars, and told Ambassador Kellis that he did not understand what had happened, because he had not said anything special. He had only answered the question he was asked, and told the truth about what had happened on Meridian 4. Kellis sat down across from him and smiled the tired smile of a man who had spent 30 years in diplomacy, and had never once seen a room full of alien civilizations brought to silence by the words of a teenager. "That is exactly why it worked," Kellis said. "You told the truth in a room full of beings who have spent millennia perfecting the art of saying everything except the truth, and they did not know what to do with it." Elias shook his head and looked down at the obsidian star still pinned to his chest, and at the crystalline thorn that Zarathia had given him, which he had carefully wrapped in cloth and placed in his pocket, because he was afraid of breaking it. "I just wanted them to stop looking at me like I was a joke," he said quietly. "I just wanted them to know that the metal meant something." "You did far more than that," Kellis said. The political consequences of that evening unfolded over the weeks and months that followed in ways that no one, not even the most experienced galactic analysts, had predicted. The summit had been trending toward a vote to restrict humanity's expansion rights, because many of the elder species saw humans as too aggressive and too unpredictable and too dangerously ambitious for a species that had only been part of the galactic community for 62 years. And there had been serious discussion about confining human territory to a small bubble around the Sol system for at least another century. That vote never happened. Instead, Queen Zarathia personally sponsored a motion to elevate humanity to protected developing civilization status, a designation that came with full trade rights, territorial guarantees, military mutual defense agreements, and access to elder technology that most young species had to wait thousands of years to receive. When her own nobles challenged her, and they did, loudly and publicly, because the Velkari were not a species that changed their minds easily, Zarathia silenced them with a single statement that would be carved into the diplomatic archives of every civilization in the galaxy. "Any species that breeds individuals who will crawl back into the fire on a broken leg for a child they do not know," she said. And her voice carried the absolute authority of a queen who had ruled for 3 centuries and had no intention of explaining herself twice. "That species will outlast us all, and I would rather have them as allies now than discover what they become as enemies in 1,000 years. The Crethari response was equally dramatic and far more personal. War Chief Grothon formally requested a military exchange program with the Terran Armed Forces, the first time in recorded history that the Crethari had sought to learn from another species rather than conquer them. And when his own war council questioned the decision, asking what the most powerful warrior species in the galaxy could possibly learn from a civilization that was physically weaker than nearly every other spacefaring race, Grothon answered with the blunt honesty that his species was known for. "The Crethari fight because we are strong," he said. "Humans fight because they must. And I have seen 10,000 battles across 100 worlds, and I tell you now with absolute certainty, the one who fights because they must is the one you never defeat. Because you can break their bodies, and you can destroy their weapons, and you can burn their worlds to ash, and they will still crawl through the fire to pull one more life from the wreckage. I do not want to fight that," he said. "I want to understand." The exchange program began within a year, and the sight of Crethari warriors training alongside human soldiers became one of the most unlikely and strangely moving images in galactic culture. Massive predators learning not how to fight harder, but how to fight for something beyond victory itself. As for Elias, he did not become a soldier. Despite having every military academy in the Terran system offering him immediate admission, and despite the Crethari formally inviting him to train with their warrior elite, an honor that species had gone to war over, Elias chose a different path. He enrolled in the Terran Diplomatic Academy, and he became a diplomat because he said that he had seen enough of what happened when people could not talk to each other, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure they could. He was quiet in his studies and diligent in his work, and he never sought attention or used his fame to advance his career. Who taught him said that the most remarkable thing about him was not his intelligence or his skill, but his ability to listen, truly listen, to beings who were nothing like him and find the common ground that everyone else had missed. He never spoke publicly about Meridian 4 again. When journalists and historians asked him for interviews about that night in the conclave hall, he politely declined every single time, and when they asked why, he simply said that the story did not belong to him. It belonged to the 300 people who died and to the 900 who survived, and to a 6-year-old girl named Priya who had been brave in the dark. But in the Terran Diplomatic Academy, in the main hall where the portraits of humanity's greatest ambassadors and peacemakers hung alongside those of admirals and generals, they placed a portrait of Elias Ward at the age of 16, not in his dress uniform with the obsidian star, but in a simple photograph taken on the day he enrolled, showing a young man with steady eyes and a quiet expression that gave away nothing of what he carried inside. Beneath the portrait, on a small brass plaque, were engraved 10 words that every student who passed through those halls would read and remember. He was asked to explain a medal. He explained humanity. Many years later, when Elias was no longer young, and his dark hair had turned to gray, and the prophetic beneath his left knee had been replaced twice, he returned to Meridian 4. The colony had been rebuilt, not just rebuilt but transformed, because the terraforming that his mother and her colleagues had begun all those years ago had finally taken hold, and the barren rocky world that Elias remembered was now covered in fields of green and blue vegetation that stretched to the horizon under a sky that was almost, but not quite the same shade of blue as Earth's. He walked slowly through the memorial garden that had been planted at the center of the new colony, where a wall of polished black stone bore the names of every person who had died in the attack, and he moved along that wall with his fingers trailing across the surface until he found the name he was looking for. Priya Sharma, age 6. He placed a small flower at the base of the wall, a pale violet bloom that grew only on Meridian 4, a species that had emerged naturally from the terraformed soil, as if the planet itself had decided to create something beautiful from what had been lost. He stood there for a long time, in the quiet of the garden, with the wind moving through the new trees, and the sound of children playing somewhere in the distance. Children who were alive because of what had happened here. Children who were the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the people he had carried through the dark. A voice interrupted his silence, young and direct, and carrying the unmistakable rumbling undertone of a Krathari. He turned and saw a young Krathari female, barely past adolescence by their species standards, wearing the uniform of the exchange program and carrying a data pad that identified her as a student. She recognized him immediately, and her amber eyes went wide. "You are Elias Ward," she said, and it was not a question. "You are the one the galaxy bowed to." Elias looked at her and smiled, a tired, kind smile that carried decades of living and loss and quiet purpose behind it. "The galaxy did not bow to me," he said gently. "They bowed to a scared kid who just did not want anyone else to die alone." He turned back to the wall and touched Priya's name one more time with his fingertips. "I am just the one who lived to tell the story," he said. The Krathari student stood beside him in respectful silence, and together they looked at the names on the wall, while the wind moved through the garden, and the children played, and the world that had almost been a grave continued, stubbornly, beautifully, impossibly, to live. And somewhere in the archives of the Grand Conclave, in a recording that had been viewed by more beings than any other in galactic history, a boy's voice spoke words that would endure long after empires fell, and stars burned out, and the galaxy itself grew old. Because they were scared, and they were small, and there was no one else. That was the answer.